Hello, and welcome to this first presentation of two on the topic of the transition from the medieval world to the modern world. In a previous video lecture, we talked about some of the features of the medieval world, and one of the most prominent was the central authority of the church. In order to know how the modern world, as we understand it, came about, we need to understand how that central authority began to come unraveled. We will talk about that in this video presentation. In this video, we will do the following. We will identify three central events leading to the beginning of modernity. We will talk about a technical innovation, the triangular cell, that led to the enrichment of Italian city-states and to the possibility of navigation on a much grander scale than the Europeans had previously known. We will talk about the rise of the Italian city-states. And in connection with that rise of these city-states, we will talk about an intellectual development that takes place within them. The emergence of a new humanism. We will focus on just three figures of that humanist movement: Dante, Boccaccio, and Machiavelli. We will begin to think about the Protestant Reformation. We will begin this by thinking about what weakened the church to the point that the Reformation became possible. We will talk about the Avignon papal exile. We will mention the practice of indulgences. We will talk about Martin Luther's opening move in the Reformation. We will talk about his correspondence with the Northern European humanist Erasmus. We will talk about Martin Luther's attitude about the law in contrast with that of Thomas Aquinas. We will talk finally about the Catholic Counter-Reformation. In doing so, we'll talk about the Council of Trent and the establishment of the Society of Jesus. And we will mention one underrated Jesuit philosopher, Francisco Suarez, and his refinement of natural law in light of Martin Luther's criticisms. The 20th century German-born Jewish-American political philosopher Hannah Arendt claims in her book, The Human Condition, that the modern world arises in concert with three crucial events: the discovery of the New World, the Protestant Reformation, and Galileo's telescope. In this video presentation, we will mention the first and concentrate on the second. In the next presentation, we will say some more about the implications of the first, and we will detail the third. During the Middle Ages in Europe, there had been relatively little incentive to engage in trade. There was no monetary or finance system. Charging interest, usury, was illegal, and desires for goods were somewhat circumscribed by the manneral outlook of self-sufficiency. Europe was far more hermetic, and by that I mean that it was quite cut off in its relations to the rest of the world. Of course, the rest of the world, naturally enough, began to come into contact with Europe. In the first place, the expansion of Islam across North Africa brought Europe into contact with Muslims as they began to cross from North Africa into the Iberian Peninsula, where Spain and Portugal are located. We have already seen that this contact was fruitful for the Europeans in that they received back from Islamic sources the writings of Aristotle. They also received from these sources the pointed arch. Both of these transmissions had profound effects on Europe. The Crusades, of course, brought Europeans into regular contact with Islam and with the Muslims of the Middle East. In contrast to medieval Europe, Middle Eastern Islamic civilization was cosmopolitan with expansive international relations and trade. And the European Crusaders must have been somewhat flabbergasted by the amount of rich consumer goods that they saw when they were in the Middle East. Eventually, these Western Europeans began to develop tastes for the consumer goods they had seen when they were in the Middle East. But overland trade was a difficult prospect. It was very cumbersome. Nevertheless, the beginning of trade allowed the city-states of Italy to dramatically increase their income. These city-states were granted a papal monopoly of trade with the Saracens, and Saracens is a medieval catch-all word for anybody who is Muslim. And with this monopoly, they grew very wealthy. Venice was the first state to be granted a trade permit, but the other city-states soon followed, and this allowed them to all become very wealthy. As I mentioned a moment ago, overland trade was quite difficult, and ultimately the trade routes were cut off. Fortunately for the Europeans, a technical innovation widely used among Arabs facilitated sea trade. That innovation was the triangular sail, which allows a ship with sails to virtually sail against the wind by a technique known as tacking. This innovation dramatically expanded the European capacity for seafaring. This innovation also combined with an increased European desire for trade with the East that ultimately motivated Europeans to seek new trade routes. And of course, this led to their bumbling in to the New World, which is to say that it facilitated Arendt's first hallmark, that is, the discovery of the New World. The Italian city-states, with their new wealth, grew in population, with a lot more people moving into the cities. Some of these cities surpassed 100,000 inhabitants. Life in Italy began to look more and more different from life in the provincial Europe on the other side of the Alps. In the midst of all this growing Italian vitality, a new intellectual movement took root that is called humanism. Whereas traditional Christian civilization emphasized God and the next life, humanism emphasized human endeavors and accomplishments. In particular, it renewed interest in the accomplishments of the classical world of ancient Greece and Rome, but especially of Rome. Let us look at three of these intellectual humanists: Dante, Boccaccio, and Machiavelli. Humanism is usually thought to have gotten off the ground with Petrarch's rediscovery of the work of the great Roman orator, statesman, and philosopher Cicero. Before Petrarch, however, Dante Alighieri, and his years are 1265 to 1321, had already established the main lines of humanism. He wrote his poetry in Italian rather than the Latin of the Church, and he is thought to be the greatest poet of the Italian language. His masterpiece is the Divine Comedy, a great epic of the journey of life that takes place in 3 books: the Inferno, the Purgatorio, and the Paradiso. The most famous of these, and the most fun, is the Inferno, Dante's epic journey into the depths of hell with the Roman poet Virgil as his tour guide. Hell itself is a magnificent crevice caused by God thrusting Lucifer into the earth. Lucifer is in fact sitting in a frozen lake in the pit of hell. And with his 3 mouths on, 3 faces, he eternally chews on the 3 greatest sinners of history, all guilty of treachery. They are Judas Iscariot, Cassius, and Brutus. This list of sinners indicates that Dante has not yet fully developed the humanist attitude, because he favors the Roman Empire over the Roman Republic. For later humanists, and this sentiment reaches all the way to the U.S. Constitution, Cassius and Brutus had simply given the most treacherous Roman what he deserved. That great traitor was Julius Caesar, who had betrayed the Roman Republic. Dante works his way down to Lucifer through the various levels of hell, and in those levels he sees all the souls of many of the great protagonists of literature and history. Dante then betrays an extensive classical knowledge and marks himself as a great humanist. Once he manages to get to the bottom of hell, which is at the center of earth, he then begins his ascent upward in the next 2 books until ultimately he sees the face of God. Boccaccio. We might think of Boccaccio as the inventor of the short story. His masterpiece is the Decameron, a collection of 100 short stories. There is also a framing story for the piece. In that story, a group of rich Florentines flee to a countryside estate to get away from the Black Plague. And in this pastoral setting, they entertain each other by telling the stories that constitute Boccaccio's book. My favorite story is about a Jew who travels to Rome and sees the church there. This is enough to make him convert to Christianity. When someone asks him how he could convert to Christianity after he saw how corrupt Rome was, he says that in light of the church surviving more than 1,000 years in spite of all the corruption, he has been led to understand that God must be guiding the institution. The last humanist that we will mention here is Niccolo Machiavelli. Machiavelli is a contemporary of Pope Julius II and Michelangelo. He collaborates with Leonardo da Vinci on a civic project. He was a political leader in the Florentine Republic. And it was his humanistic education that qualified him for this political position. Ultimately, though, the great banking family of Florence, the Medici, returned to power in Florence, and Machiavelli is exiled. It is during this exile that he does all of his important writing. We will say more about Machiavelli's writings, The Prince and the Discourses, in the next video presentation. For now, though, it is important to realize that Machiavelli essentially invents the modern practice of doing history. And he is the humanist most clearly present as the arbitrary temporal barrier is passed from the medieval world to modern times. Usually we set the division between the medieval and the modern at around 1500. Machiavelli writes through this transitive period, and he does so in such a striking way that there is a claim to be made that he is the first modern philosopher. This happens to be my view. In general, however, it is usually Descartes who gets that distinction. Machiavelli dies in 1527, about 10 years after Martin Luther sent his 95 Theses to the Archbishop of Mainz on 31 October 1517. This is the traditional starting date for the second of Arendt's three hallmarks of modernity, the Protestant Reformation. From this date on, Christianity in Western Europe divides itself on theological grounds that leave Europeans fighting long, bloody, and exhausting religious wars against each other. How, though, did the central authority of the Latin Church get to the point that this was possible? The most important event that fractured Roman Catholic political control of Western Europe was moving the papacy from Rome to Avignon in France for a period of about 70 years. A French pope, Clement V, was elected, and he refused to take up his papal seat in Rome. During the papal period in Avignon, only French popes were elected. And this gave the appearance of undue French influence over the church. This was especially apparent to the princes of the German states and also to England, which was at the time fighting, or was for most of the time, fighting a war with France, the 100 Years' War. It should come as no surprise then that Protestantism first gets underway in England and in Germany. At the end of the Avignon period, Pope Gregory XI moved the papacy back to Rome. This did not stop the disputes, however. After the death of Gregory, a French college of cardinals elected another French pope, while the Roman college elected a different pope. Not until the election of Pope Martin V was this schism in the Western Church reconciled. By that time, however, the church was in serious financial difficulties. It is under these conditions that the traditional practice of indulgence is altered. Under Roman Catholic doctrine, a person who repents is forgiven. There is, however, a temporal punishment consequent to the sin that the penitent is subject to either in this life or in purgatory. Dante illustrates this doctrine quite colorfully in the Purgatorio. This temporal punishment can be lessened by good works from the penitent. Indulgences are good works directed at diminishing temporal punishment. Eventually, charitable donations were considered good works warranting indulgence. And church officials used indulgences as a way of raising money. By the late Middle Ages, however, indulgences became a matter of clear corruption by parties authorized to grant these indulgences. While Martin Luther had many qualms with Roman Catholic theology as it existed in his day, it is against indulgences that he makes his first foray with his famous 95 Theses. While Luther may not have wanted to break off and start an entire religious movement, that is how it turned out. It should be noted, though, that Luther, in fact, had a completely alternative theology to the Roman Catholic theology, as it was developed by Thomas Aquinas. Remember that Thomas had synthesized Roman Catholic theology with the philosophy of Aristotle. Luther said that Aristotle was the buffoon who had corrupted the church. Luther had been an Augustinian monk belonging to an order that revered St. Augustine. St. Augustine had been a pagan who interestingly found his way into the church through Cicero and Plato. His theology was markedly Platonic, and Martin Luther followed St. Augustine. One way of thinking about the Catholic-Protestant division is that they prioritize Plato and Aristotle differently. One point of difference between Martin Luther's outlook and that of the Catholic Church merits further remark. Remember from the last video that Thomas Aquinas is regarded as one of the premier voices of the natural law tradition in philosophy. Thomas's position is that natural law is a matter of reason. This position is known in philosophy as intellectualism. Saying that God's law is subject to reason, however, seems to relegate God's will to being subject to reason. And from Martin Luther's position, this takes away from God's omnipotence. Luther says instead that God's law depends only on his will, which is inscrutable to reason. This position is known as voluntarism. Before rupturing with Luther and those who followed him, the church sought to reconcile. The Pope asked the great Renaissance humanist Erasmus to enter into a correspondence with Luther to try to bring him back. In his correspondence, Luther insisted on the final religious authority of the Bible. Erasmus, though, taking a clue from the classical world, invoked academic skepticism to try to raise a doubt about the justification of Luther's claim. Erasmus wondered how Luther could have a justified claim to know that the Bible was the Word of God. And even if it is, he further wondered how Luther could know that he had the right interpretation of it. Erasmus argued along the lines of the ancient skeptics, that in the absence of such standards, one would be wise to fall back on the customs of one's people. Luther, however, strongly rejected this line of reasoning, saying that no one who is a skeptic could be a true Christian. But he didn't really have a philosophical answer to the problem that Erasmus presented. In any case, the attempt to reconcile was a failure, and the rupture of Catholic and Protestants proceeded. One result of this rupture was a reaction to the charges made by the Protestants against the Catholic Church. Pope Paul III initiated the Council of Trent, which commissioned a standing committee of cardinals to establish reforms from within the church. Seminaries were instituted to give proper training to priests. A strong political countercurrent was instituted that became the basis of the Spanish Inquisition. Mendicant orders were returned to their spiritual roots, and new orders were instituted. The most notable of these new mendicant orders was the Society of Jesus, founded by Ignatius of Loyola and several others. These mendicants swore strict obedience to the Pope and became known as God's soldiers or God's Marines. They soon took control of most Catholic education, including Catholic universities. Out of the Jesuit movement arose in Spain one great but significantly underrated philosopher, Francisco Suarez. Although a turgid writer, Suarez made many contributions to various areas of philosophy. One is worth commenting on. Remember that Luther had differed from Thomas Aquinas' intellectualism with his voluntarism that insisted on the priority of God's omnipotent will. Suarez worked out an interesting synthesis. He said that the law is in fact reflective of God's eternal reason, and in this sense the law is co-eternal with God in the way that Thomas had said it is. Reason in this sense, however, is not yet fully formulated and legislated law. A reason becomes law if and only if God wills that reason to be law. God's will, then, is preeminent in the way that Luther had insisted upon it. Think about whether Suarez has managed to hit the truth on this point. And that does it for part one of the movement from the medieval to the modern. In this presentation, we have introduced Arendt's three hallmarks of modernity. We have talked about the triangular cell. We've talked about the rise of the Italian city-states and the new humanism. We talked about three proponents of the new humanism: Dante, Boccaccio, and Machiavelli. We went over the Protestant Reformation and identified a number of events that precipitated that Reformation. We talked about the Roman Catholic Counter-Reformation and the contributions of one Jesuit philosopher, Francisco Suarez. Thank you. The end.